Hello all, I just wanted to go through another student submission to the week 3 class-based assignment, um, and the errors that were in it. I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at actually the errors and trying to fix them. So here we go. Hit play. Um, I walk up to this button, my character walks up to this button, and obviously the trapdoor here isn't opening. Um, But I'm also getting, I look at the console and I'm getting no errors. So why isn't it opening? So I look at I look at the code now in 1 second, but I see that there's a level manager, and it's got a level manager controller. There's a trapdoor, which is this game object here, and it has a trapdoor controller. And there's a button open door switch. It has an open button controller, and there's a button close door switch, which is this chap here, and it has a close button controller. So let's have a look at these scripts. Okay, so we'll look at the open button controller, I guess, and I'm looking to see, is there a collision entered D? There is indeed. It's checking to see if the thing that collided with me is tagged player. I'm going to just go back here again. I'm going to look at the open button here, and I'm just going to double check that the collider, there's the collider, it's a polygon collider, and it's not set to is trigger. That's good, because the student has used on collision entity D, so this would indeed be called. And then they're calling level manager.open trapdoor. That looks a little bit strange to me, because I would have gone level manager.instance, I suspect. Yeah, because there's the level manager. It's got an instance variable, which gets a static instance variable, which gets set in the awake function. So if it was me, I would have gone level manager.instance.open trapdoor. But I see that this student has got an instance variable called level manager. And I go back here, I look at the button open door, I see the L manager, and it is wired up. It has been instantiated, so the student has dragged the level manager in here, which sort of takes from having to write this as a singleton in the first place. But anyway, that's not the cause of the error. I wouldn't suggest doing it this way. If it was me, and I'll just sort of correct it as I going along, I guess, I would have gotten rid of this, and I would have just gone level manager dot instance. And that's the beauty of using a singleton, that you don't need to wire it up. You can just sort of access its static instance variable anytime you want it. But anyway, that wasn't the cause of the code not working. So they're calling open trapdoor on the level manager. I see it initially they're setting open button to true, then they're setting open button to false, and then when you leave the collision they're setting open button to true. I'm not sure why the student is doing this. I'll leave it here for the time being, but it seems to be setting the variable but never really using it. I'm surprised there's not a an if statement, something like if O button unpressed equals something. But so I don't think this is going to have any effect. So actually let me get rid of it, because I don't think it's going to have any effect. We don't really need to know anything about on collision enter 2D, so we can get rid of that. Again, these changes, we don't need to set it here. So we actually don't need this here either. Now these changes that I'm making aren't the cause of any errors, but I just think it's redundant code. I also noticed that the student has put in a comment here saying should these be private, so should these instance variables, including the one I've just deleted, should they be private? They've made them public. Well, the rule of thumb is if it's a variable that you want to initialize or wire up, as I say, via the inspector, well then they usually need to be public. And also if they're variables that other scripts need to access, well then they have to be public. But if they're variables that just this script needs to access and you don't intend wiring them up via the inspector, well then they can be private. But if you make everything public, then everything would work. But sometimes it's better to make things that don't need to be public private, but leaving them public won't actually cause errors. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'll get rid of the comment as well. So I have a start function that's empty now and an update function that's empty as well, so I can get rid of those as well. Empty functions are not needed. So again, these are not the causes of any errors, but I'm just getting rid of redundant code. So this is what it's looking like. So the student is correct when you on collision enter 2D occurs. They're calling the open trapdoor function on the level manager. So let's look at the level manager. Here's the level manager. It's got a trapdoor controller, a TD controller variable. Let me see, has this been wired up via the inspector? And it has. There's a trapdoor controller. So I suspect that the student has dragged this into here. So that looks good. With the wake, it looks good. And then I have the open trapdoor function that the open button controller is calling when you walk into it, and it is saying to the trapdoor controller it's calling the open function. And there's also a close trapdoor function. So this is looking perfect. So now I'm going to go to the trapdoor controller and have a look at its open function. So I look at its open function and it says if the HJ motor speed is less than or equal to 9, a little bit strange. I don't know why the student has picked the value 9, but anyway, if the motor speed of the joint, the hinge joint, is less than or equal to 9, well then make it 10. Okay, so that's not quite how you'd set the value of a motor speed on a hinge joint. So this is probably the problem. Again, I don't know why they're using 9 and 10. I notice here in the close they're saying if the hinge joint motor speed is greater than or equal to -9, well then set it to -10. Again, that's not the way you would set a motor speed, and I don't know why they're using these values. But let's fix it. I also see in the update function they have open close. So the update function is going to get called every frame. So 60 times a second they're going to call it open, close, open, close, open, close. So this looks very wrong. Like, you know, the update function shouldn't be calling open close. Everything was going great up until this point, in as much as when the player walks into the button calls open trapdoor on the level manager calls open on the trapdoor controller. Open on the trapdoor controller is trying to set the motor speed. The update function shouldn't be calling open or close functions at all. So I'm going to get rid of these. I suspect this is definitely an error. Now that the update function is empty, I'm also going to get rid of it. I don't need it, and I'll get rid of the comment. I see here that this trapdoor controller has a reference to the hinge joint. They've called it a TD hinge, maybe trapdoor hinge, I suspect it's short for. So let me have a look here. Let me look at the trapdoor, and there's TD hinge. There you go, and it is actually set to trapdoor hinge. So I suspect they're after grabbing this hinge joint and dropping it down there. That's fine. It also has a private variable set to HJ motor. So because it's private, of course, we're not going to see it here. So that never gets initialized. So that's never put equal to anything. And not only is it never put equal to anything, but then in the start speed, it's trying to put this variable that's never really initialized to anything, and they're trying to access the motor speed and put it equal to 0. So this could cause problems as well. But I understand what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is trying to access the motor on the hinge. So I'm going to do it for them. I'm going to get rid of this. We don't need it. I'm going to get rid of this. We don't need it. And so now we don't need a start either. I can always add it in again if we want it. So here's how you do it. I need to. So all these now are giving errors because I've deleted the reference to the variable. So I would. It's a joint motor, I think it's called. Let me just actually, let's get the reference again. It's a joint motor 2D, sorry, joint motor 2D. So let me just delete this again. So I will create a variable of type joint motor 2D, and I'll call it the motor. So that's a variable that can hold a joint motor 2D. It's currently holding nothing. And then I'll say the motor is equal to the hinge. Now I'm going up to the hinge. Excuse me. The the hinge dot motor. There we go. So I'm connecting up to the hinge that's been wired up via the inspector, and I'm accessing the motor and I'm storing it in this local variable here. So essentially what I'm doing is in code I'm accessing this motor section here, and I'm storing it in the local variable. Now I'm going to set it, and it looks like this person wants to set it to 10. I don't understand why there's an if statement around it, so I'm going to get rid of it and hope it doesn't break anything. So I'll say the motor dot motor speed is equal to 10. So I haven't, so that hasn't set the speed up here. It has set the speed on the copy that I've taken. So I've taken a copy of the motor from the hinge joint, and it's stored in a local variable, and I've now modified that local variable. So now what I need to do is write it back up. So then I go td hinge dot motor is equal to the motor. So I think the easiest way for me to explain this is essentially you take a sort of a copy of the motor on the hinge, store it in a local variable, modify the motor speed on that local variable, or modify the motor speed on that copy, in other words, and then overwrite the motor on the hinge with the copy. So you're actually overwriting it with exactly what you've copied, except that you've changed the motor speed. So that should work, and then I think I can get rid of this. So that's how you go and do it. So that's looking good, and I see down here they're setting it to -10, so it's essentially going to be exactly the same code. So let me just copy that, let me paste this in here, and we'll change this to -10. So I think this should work. Go back here, let's press play. Well, the good news is I'm not getting any errors here. Let me just keep an eye. There's a trapdoor. Let me keep an eye on the motor speed to see does it get set now. So I walk over to my open door. Yeah, and it's got set to 10, and my door is opening. That's great. And now I go down to the closed door. Where is it? There it is. I'm on the closed door, and it's getting set to -10. But it's not closing. Maybe if I was to set it to -20, yeah, so I just haven't set it to a big enough force. So if I had set it to -20, it would have closed. So simply all I need to do is go into my code and change this to -20. The force of the motor, the speed of the motor wasn't strong enough. Gravity was stronger and was pulling it down. There was another error in this student's code, which I've actually fixed already, but let me tell you what it was. This student had, this is the trapdoor, and had accidentally set the rigid body to be kinematic. And I suspect that the reason they did that was when they created the trapdoor first, before they put a hinge on it. So let me show you what I mean. They would have created a trapdoor, maybe put a rigid body on it, but not a hinge joint on it. And then when they hit play, it just falls to the ground. So to stop it from falling to the ground, they would have made it kinematic maybe, and then hit play, and it no longer falls to the ground. But then they got the hinge joint working. They added a hinge joint and got the code working, and never changed it back from kinematic. So now when I walk into it, nothing happens. Even though the motor will get set to 10, nothing happens. And that's because it's set to kinematic. So I can set it back to dynamic, and it won't fall now because there's a hinge joint attached to it. So even though it's dynamic and it used to fall, it won't anymore because there's a hinge joint attached to it. And when I hit it, it will open up. Let me just go over there. Let's pop down there. And then when I hit this one, now that the force is -20, it's closing. And there you go. There's a solution to that one. So that was an interesting sort of set of errors, and some sort of redundant code. So the code, I think, is much cleaner now as well.